Like commercial skyscrapers, grain elevators were key elements in some of Chicago's most remarkable financial episodes. They shared with tall office buildings their physical manifestations of location, efficiency, and size, all of which proved to be exploitable by clever speculators. The fiscal instruments that translated elevators' bulk into profit were more complex than those that underlay commercial skyscrapers, and they provided leverage that exposed grain traders to far greater volatility than land speculators. If the commercial skyscraper was truly, quote, a machine for making the land pay, in the words of Minneapolis-based architect Cass Gilbert, grain elevators were machines for making Chicago's entire hinterland pay, and traders used this fiscal leverage derived from this vast territory to outduel one another. The financial buccaneering of 19th century grain traders emerged as an unintended consequence of attempts to keep the commodities market honest. Prices paid for wheat, corn, or other agricultural products depended on whether those goods were healthy, unadulterated, and vermin-free, but progress toward a robust grain quality system was halting. The Chicago Board of Trade's organization in 1848 codified elevator receipts for grain and established rudimentary standards. Illinois passed warehousing laws in 1851 that required paper receipts to reflect actual quantities of grain being stored. Collectively, these formed a verifiable record of each transaction, and their veracity meant that they could be traded themselves, eliminating the difficulty of moving grain itself around as its ownership changed hands. Corn or wheat could sit in elevators while its fate was decided on the floor of the Board of Trade, and it might go through several owners before finally being loaded onto a lake boat and taken east. As railroads bought grain in much greater volumes, speculation grew proportionally. The telegraph's advent in 1848 brought information on grain prices from the east, making it possible to gamble on fluctuations in prices all over the eastern seaboard. Traders began to take advantage of so-called futures contracts, devised to guarantee farmers that their crops would be welcomed at country elevators at harvest, and that promised prices at monthly dates in the future. Warehouse receipts and futures soon formed their own paper markets on the board. Traders who had never set foot on a farm or in an elevator delivered grain to one another that they would never see or hold, but which sat undisturbed in one of the city's elevators. Futures also enabled short selling, or betting on declining grain prices, which in turn led to cornering attempts, all in bets on rising prices, in which a bullish investor would purchase futures from bearish investors trying to short sell, while also hoarding grain for that delivery date so that bears could never fulfill their contracts. With supply limited, market prices would rise, and short sellers would be compelled to settle contracts with grain bought at exorbitant prices from those engineering the corners themselves. The threat of bankruptcy meant that corners were effective weapons, since they allowed the most daring traders to acquire whole companies in exchange for discharging exorbitant debts. By 1875, the city's trade in real grain was dwarfed by speculation. While the city's grain elevators had been passive tools, they soon played active roles in the Board of Trade's escalating economic gamesmanship, attracting an ever more ruthless class of trader to the leverage that their vast storage capacities represented. By far the most conniving of these was meatpacking titan Philip D. Armour. Armour had made his fortune parlaying profits from a gold rush sluicing business into a spectacular bet on falling pork prices at the end of the Civil War. Armour realized that he stood to gain further by using the financial leverage from these short sales to break the country's meatpacking companies, flooding the market and sinking operations at deflated prices one city at a time. After vicious takeovers in Cleveland, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and New York, Armour arrived in Chicago in 1867 and centralized his packing operations there, taking advantage of the city's railroad network to make Armour and Company the largest meat processing company in the world. Armour's foray into wheat repeated this aggressive approach by betting against traders' enthusiasm for corners. He purchased a handful of elevators on the south branch of the Chicago River and began to use their 10 million bushel capacity to manipulate the Chicago market. In 1882, he hoarded grain to ensure that local prices stayed 20 to 30 cents per bushel higher than other markets in the country, importing huge quantities from surrounding cities at reduced costs and allowing his elevators to absorb the extra supply, limiting access to other traders and driving local prices higher. Following this successful venture, Armour built fleets of ships and rail cars that broadened his supply network, enabling him to short sell with confidence. In 1887, having sensed a corner attempt by Cincinnati banker E.L. Harper, Armour hired Joseph T. Moulton to build 2 mammoth elevators on Goose Island on the North Branch, connected to the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. These would serve as his financial bulwarks, storehouses that turned grain into ammunition against overconfident futures downtown. Joseph T. Moulton had emigrated to Chicago from New Hampshire in 1853, gaining experience as a laborer in one of the city's riverfront elevators. He went on to revolutionize the grain elevator business by standardizing construction and incorporating new conveying innovations. His debut as an elevator builder was the massive 800,000 bushel structure built for bankers Solomon Sturgis and the Buckingham family, merchants from Ohio, in 1855. Adjacent to the Illinois Central rail yards in the river's mouth, Moulton's structure nearly doubled the city's storage capacity. Within 2 years, he built a second adjacent structure for Sturgis and Buckingham that was 50% larger. At 130 feet tall, Sturgis and Buckingham's so-called A and B elevators represented the state of the art. Grain was shoveled from Illinois Central cars into hoppers next to and below the tracks. From there, conveyor belts fitted with metal scoops carried it or elevated it to a narrow cupola at the structure's peak, where they discharged the grain into 2 stacked boxes. The first, a garner, held 1,000 bushels. When full, it discharged into a hopper below that weighed the batch and allowed a grader to take a sample for inspection. Graders could then direct the incoming shipment to a specific bin below through a rotating chute, ensuring that each bin would contain grain of equal quality. The elevators then discharged grain into ships through chutes on the wharf side. The result combined efficiency and handling with a vast storage capacity, all at a scale that made Sturgis and Buckingham's elevators, along with roughly 100 other structures constructed in the city over the next century, sublime landmarks on Chicago's skyline. Moulton's elevators impressed and terrified chroniclers of the city, including Anthony Trollope, who on his 1861 visit wrote of their elephantine bulk and their, quote, great hungering stomachs and huge unsatisfied maws. Moulton's elevators for Sturgis and Buckingham set standards for the next 50 years. Steam power ran shafts, pulleys, and belts that filled elevators' cupolas with motion and sound. Belt conveyors were shaped into V's that prevented spillage or into slopes that discharged into bins. Self-contained mechanical legs limited spillage, while belt tightening systems assured constant speed and operation. Grain could be switched into circuits that cleaned, dried, or sifted it if a grader determined that it was of inferior quality, while powered shovels attached to chain drives reduced the time it took to empty a rail car. Systems that accepted grain from hoppers underneath these cars, or that tilted full cars to discharge their contents to one side, sped this process even further. These advances automated receiving, handling, and storing grain, all critical given that Chicago's perpetual labor shortage and the trade's seasonal nature. Loading a 40,000 bushel lake boat took a dozen laborers an entire day in the 1840s. In Moulton's elevators, one worker could move this much grain out of rail cars in an hour. And by the 1880s, elevators with more powerful steam engines and more sophisticated handling equipment cut this to a mere 15 minutes. Bins were at the heart of Moulton's system. They formed the bulk of an elevator's structure and bore the tremendous weight of thousands of bushels. They had to be designed for the grain's dead weight and for the bursting stresses caused by its fluid pressure. Brick or stone walls could not develop the bending strength to restrain tall columns of grain, so instead Moulton relied on crib construction, which became standard in Chicago and throughout North America. 2-inch thick timber planks, ranging in width from 4 to 8 inches, were nailed and spiked together horizontally, with wider planks at the bin's bases and narrower ones at their tops. These provided increasing strength toward bins' bases, where the outward pressure of grain was greatest, aided by iron tie rods running across or around each of them. Crib construction was resource intensive, Such somber piles of joining were only economical while lumber flowed through Chicago in vast quantities. As late as 1902, however, wood remained, quote, the cheapest and most available material in America, and it formed all of Chicago's large 19th century elevators. Moulton's 1887 Goose Island elevators and their rail links gave Armour access to wheat from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas to add to his supply from western Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, doubling his territory to over 12,000 miles of track. Construction began secretly, but in May the Tribune ambushed Moulton and Armour and demanded to know what was rising on their massive construction site. The two concocted a story about beating new elevator legislation contemplated by the state, but, sensing that their secret was out, Armour paid Moulton to rush construction, and the 2,200,000 bushel elevators were finished in just over a month. Armour A and B included more than 8 million board feet of lumber and boasted the first electric lighting system in any Chicago elevator. Their machinery was run by a 1,000-horsepower condensing engine connected to 29 separate chutes serving rail sidings and a shipping wharf, all of which could load or unload more than 100,000 bushels a day, critical speed given the need to accumulate vast quantities of corner-busting grain without alerting traders to the growing stockpile. The two elevators cost Armour an estimated $600,000, or just over $17 million in 2019 figures. Moulton's 30-day elevators won the day. Armour accumulated enough grain to defeat the corner, breaking Harper financially, wrecking his Cincinnati bank, and giving, quote, a blow to the grain trade of Chicago from the effects of which it will be long before it recovers. Armour furthered his strategy with an even larger structure during an 1893 corner attempt by trader John Cudahy. On March 23rd, Armour broke ground on the B Annex, a 3.5 million bushel elevator in the island's center, connected to A and B by quarter-mile long belts. People on the exchange would like to know, wrote the Tribune, suspecting that Armour was once again preparing for battle, quote, what connection there is between the great deal in May wheat and the big elevator which Armour is erecting on Goose Island. With the Columbian Exposition scheduled to open on May 1st, Moulton had already committed his entire labor force elsewhere. Armour was forced to serve as his own contractor, competing with exposition work by offering carpenters up to $15 a day, or over $400 in current terms. More than 700 workers completed the elevator in time to fulfill the contract. To save time, they waited to install equipment to unload wheat from the B Annex until well after Armour had checkmated Cudahy. The Annex had no active rail lines underneath its bins. It sat directly on the ground and relied on neighboring elevators for loading and unloading, a clear sign that it was intended for long-term clandestine storage rather than for rapid processing. Armour expanded his elevator holdings on the river's North Branch to include two neighboring elevators, the Minnesota and the St. Paul. With these, he controlled the city's entire northwest trade. Scientific American used the A and B elevators on its cover to illustrate the grain transportation network, and they were named among the 7 wonders of Chicago by the Tribune in 1897. But their greatest moment came with the largest and most dramatic corner attempt in Chicago's history, by Joseph Leiter, son of mercantilist Levi Z. Leiter, in 1897. Wheat prices had soared that spring and summer, rising from 56.25 cents per bushel in August to 90.75 cents. Elevator operators had been desperately moving wheat out of their bins to take advantage of the rising prices, and Leiter, known to the public heretofore chiefly as a society man, in the words of the Tribune, had waded in, making conspicuous bets on the continued upward trend. Recognizing a speculative bubble and a naive mark, Armour short-sold 9 million bushels of December wheat to Leiter at $1.43 a bushel, a figure that made sense for Leiter only if the market continued its astronomical rise, or if Armour was unable to fulfill such an enormous contract. In mid-December, with Lake Superior frozen over by ice and the city's elevators standing empty during the winter lull, Leiter seemed ready to vanquish Armour and to take over the nation's largest grain and meat empires. But the city soon saw a bizarre sight that had ruinous implications for Leiter's attempt. Quote, Chicagoans have been perplexed by the arrival of steamer after steamer, laden to the water's edge with choice wheat, the Tribune reported, in spite of the fact that Chicago has always heretofore shipped wheat and not imported it. These steamers made their way to Goose Island and the South Branch, where Armour, having calculated that he had the necessary capacity, but not yet the speed to acquire and hold the necessary wheat, installed new machinery which reversed belt systems to take wheat up from the lake ships instead of discharging into them. He secretly engaged a fleet of icebreakers to open up Duluth's harbor, freeing millions of bushels to arrive by ship in addition to rail. And at the same time, he brokered a deal with Minneapolis merchant F.H. Peavy to flood the Chicago market with Minnesota and Dakota wheat by rail. When Armour's contract came due, he had not only the 9 million bushels owed to Leiter, but an additional 9 million bushels that he used to further collapse prices. By the end of December, wheat stood at just 85.5 cents. Leiter was forced to buy the 9 million bushels from Armour at $1.43, nearly doubling Armour's investment and losing Leiter over $5 million, $150 million in contemporary figures, in what the Tribune called, quote, the most stupendous generalship in connection with the handling of a food product that the eyes of man have ever seen. Armour then bought much of the wheat back from Leiter at depleted market rates, holding it until the effects of the corner wore off and prices recovered. Leiter, like Cudahy and Harper before him, was crushed. Bailed out by his wealthy family, he abandoned the grain trade, trying his luck at other commodities and eventually taking part in an ill-fated scheme to purchase the Great Wall of China. Armour found no further marks as guileless as Leiter, and the 1897 campaign was the greatest and last elevator-based corner battle. Armour died in 1901, and few had the resources or daring to match him. Further securities regulations limited opportunities for corners, but elevators continued to serve as barometers of Chicago's grain trade throughout the 20th century. The Depression brought price controls and federal intervention that consolidated the storage industry. Regulators urged that elevators be pooled, separated from the railroads that owned them, and managed to ensure consistent, fair pricing. Fires destroyed many of the city's timber elevators, including Armour's complex on Goose Island, which burned in 1930 and 1933, but many more were demolished as changes in Chicago's geography and infrastructure created new sites of interchange, making elevators along the increasingly congested Chicago River obsolete. Instead, new harbor facilities along the Calumet River encouraged a generation of concrete elevators for Cargill and other agricultural conglomerates. Grain elevators provide tangible, if no longer extant, evidence of the city's titanic financial battles. Their status as defensive weapons in the commodities warfare of the late 19th century shows that, like skyscrapers, grain elevators were not only the resultants of economic forces, but also active implements in the ebb and flow of fortunes won and lost on Chicago's Board of Trade. Capital flowed through Chicago much as grain did, and what Anthony Trollope wrote about corn contained in the city's elevators might well have applied to the flows of capital that accompanied them. Quote, and thus rivers of corn are running through these buildings night and day. The secret of all the motion and arrangement consists, of course, in the elevation. The corn is lifted up, and when lifted up, can move itself and arrange itself and weigh itself and load itself.